After waging war for 40 years, the Spanish realm and the Republic of the United States of the Seven Netherlands had concluded a 12-year truce. While Archduke Albrecht of Austria and his wife Archduchess Isabel guided the Spanish Netherlands to recovery, the Republic was headed for a civil war. Two theology professors, Jacobus Arminius and Franciscus Gomarus, had an argument that ended up causing a rift in the Protestant Church. Arminians, aka Remonstrants or baboons, and Gomarians, aka Contra-Remonstrants or mudbeggars, made each other's lives miserable. The Republic's de facto Prime Minister Johan van Oldenbarnevelt agreed with the Arminians' argument that the government should have more power over the Church. The military commander-in-chief Count Moritz van Nassau had very publicly chosen the Gomarian side by attending a Contra-Remonstrant church service. This was going nowhere good. Johan of Oldenbarnevelt was convinced that Stadtholder Maurits was planning a coup and would replace city governments with his own cronies. This act would disregard Article 13 of the Union of Utrecht and undermine the sovereignty of each independent state in favor of the central one, the States General. Stopping King Felipe II's centralization plans was one of the reasons they'd started the war in the first place. So, we're gonna gloss over the fact that Oldenbarnevelt had ignored Article 13 many times himself when it suited Holland. Okay. Of course, many people didn't think about these technicalities and already considered Count Maurits to be their sovereign. Oldenbarnevelt decided to stop the Stadtholder and take back the power he was clearly losing. He also wondered if he could replace Maurits with his younger half-brother, the somewhat invisible and less vindictive Count Frederik Hendrik of Nassau. 2 weeks after Count Maurits' cloister church stunt, the States of Holland passed a resolution with a vote of 11 against 6. Not exactly unanimous, but Oldenbarnevelt was willing to risk division in Holland to ensure the states' sovereignty and supremacy over all other states in the Union. Was it legal? Not really. Was it reckless? Very much so. The resolution consisted of 4 measures. First, Holland turned down a national synod. Holland took care of its own church business, and everyone should back off. Second, Holland cities could hire military personnel to maintain law and order against, among other things, local militias. Since the regular army was unavailable, and no one wanted to put guns in the hands of potentially rebellious citizens, the city council could hire mercenaries, so-called waardgelders. Third, no one could appeal any convictions a city's government made concerning these matters. Well, that's all legal procedures out the window. And fourth, all under state or city oath, including the garrisons, had to carry out these measures. So, everyone better get ready to take a new oath of allegiance to Holland and its cities, and no one else. And by no one else, they meant their Stadtholder and Captain General of the Holland Army, Count Maurits. Oh, and the Stadtholder had to carry out the resolution. Maurits was like, yeah, no. The Stadtholder dubbed the measures the Scherpe Resolutie, the Sharp Resolution. It did precisely what the Count feared would happen during a truce. The Union would fall apart. For decades, war had been a federal matter because no state could wage war with their respective armies on their own. The resolution meant that each of the 7 states could organize its own religion and its own army. So, 7 religions, 7 armies. Bye-bye unity, hello Spain. Maurits grabbed his brother Count Frederik Hendrik and showed up at the Holland Assembly fuming with rage. First off, why had they heard about this stupid plan from some deputies and not in person? And no, we're not taking a new oath. Their father, Prince Willem of Orange, had also refused to take King Felipe II's new oath, and for good reason. Oldenbarnevelt unleashed a tirade, but the mayor of Amsterdam, Reinier Pauw, was like, Not all cities had agreed to the resolution, mister. Now these two started fighting, and Maurits had to step in to break them up. The Count told the assembly that he'd honor the oath he had taken, and wouldn't undermine the authorities, as long as they didn't suppress the Contra-Remonstrants. The other states in the Union were baffled at Holland's wacky resolution, and the foreign ambassadors were shook. Did Oldenbarnevelt want to unleash a civil war because that's how one unleashes a civil war? I mean, there was no such thing as democracy in the Republic, but to just ignore the will of the people was plain dumb. Several Holland cities immediately hired these mercenaries. Small towns could only afford badly trained mercenary rejects. The Hague didn't even dare appoint any. It's not like they'd ever be a match for Count Maurits' highly trained bodyguards. However, Utrecht, despite not being in Holland, also hired 600 waardgelders. They needed them to defend the state against the foreign armies close to their borders. However, they'd never told their stadtholder or the States General they were worried about this. Count Maurits was like, "Why didn't you tell me you were scared? My troops are ready to help." But of course, border protection wasn't their primary concern. Utrecht wanted an army to fight their stadtholder in case he went rogue. In the weeks following the implementation of the Sharpe Resolution, everyone figured that Count Maurits would overthrow Oldenbarneveld and the Arminians by force. Count Maurits had taken oaths to protect the House of Nassau, its rights and its position. Je maintiendrai Nassau and all that. Since the fate of the house was closely intertwined with the Republic and the Calvinist religion of his father, an attack on one was an attack on all. Now all three, House, Republic and religion, were threatened at the same time. Maurits had to maintain his oaths and had no choice but to act. So, he wrote letters. He politely asked the regents to withdraw the resolution and express support for the National Synod. That's it. That's all Maurits did. But Oldenbarneveld got worried. He met with Count Maurits in August and told him he'd quit so the stadtholder could take over from him. The 69-year-old was ill often, plagued by fever and exhaustion, and was no longer the spry young lawyer he used to be. His hip had given out, and he now used a cane to move around. Maurits didn't seem to care either way, but the state of Holland was like, "No, you can't leave us at this difficult time." Oldenbarneveld stayed. Meanwhile, representatives of Holland scrambled to get to Den Briel to ensure the garrison swore the new oath to the States of Holland. Count Maurits grabbed his brother Frederik Hendrik and a few friends, 2 infantry companies, and got there first. It seemed his paranoia had gotten the better of Maurits, and he didn't want to leave his brother anywhere near Oldenbarneveld, though the Attorney General was currently recuperating in Utrecht. On September 29, 1617, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the stadtholder quietly exchanged the Den Briel garrison for his own men and told the magistrates not to take on any mercenaries. The "or else" was implied. They promised they wouldn't. Now Maurits stood down and watched to see if there was any fallout from this move. There wasn't, and he left Den Briel. Meanwhile, citizens clashed with government forces in cities all over Holland. In September 1617, the Leiden Council feared an outbreak of street violence and a possible attack on the town hall. They cordoned off the city center and deployed waardgelders to keep the crowds at a distance. When spikes were added to the fort a year later, they were dubbed Oldenbarneveld's Teeth. On October 3rd, during the festivities celebrating Leiden's relief in 1574, the mercs and citizens clashed. Several soldiers were injured by rocks thrown at them, and one person was killed. The Leiden magistrates forced all shooting companies to take the new oath of allegiance, but something was off. This new oath didn't include the standard clause that the King of Spain and his followers were their enemies. Instead, all militia members had to vow to assist the mayors with suppressing any and all troublemakers. And by troublemakers, they meant the stadtholder. Many refused to take this oath, and some 600 men were fired. Haarlem and Utrecht also purged its militia of mudbeggars, using the Leiden riots as an excuse. In Delft, the Arminian regents and pastors had voted in favor of the Sharpe Resolution, but the working class was overwhelmingly Gomarian and the mood got ominous. After a disturbance at the Nieuwe Kerk, the location of Prince Willem of Orange's tomb, the regents ignored Barneveldian Mayor Ewout van der Dussen, dropped Arminianism, and supported a national synod. Meanwhile, the Republic's Supreme Court decided with a majority vote that the so-called Sharpe Resolution was invalid and should be abolished. But Holland ignored the ruling, and the resolution remained in effect. The Arminian and Gomarian city representatives began assembling in separate meetings. Not only was the Republic imploding, Holland was as well. Spain got the popcorn. Delicious. Anyone could see that there was no room in the Republic for both the Attorney General and the Stadtholder. Some even believed that there would be no peace until both were gone. Maurits said, "There are 2 factions in the land, that of Orange and that of Spain, and the 2 chiefs of the Spanish faction are Uyttenbogaert and Oldenbarneveld. Orange and Spain in Dutch is Oranje in Spanje. It rhymes." And the people backed Maurits up. Generally, folks were still attached to the old traditions in which a noble or royal guided and led the people. God-appointed rulers were taught to always care for their subjects like a shepherd tending to his flock. It was in their job description. Regents didn't see the citizens as their subjects, though not as equals either. When people wanted to talk to Count Maurits while he was out and about, he always stopped and took the time to listen like a concerned parent. To be fair, people could always knock on Oldenbarneveld's door, and if he was at home, he talked to them, but that felt different. People never felt a fatherly connection with a bureaucratic politician. The commoners in the States General and the Commoner Supreme Oldenbarneveld had been acting as the country's sovereign and had turned it into a mess. God-appointed ruler Maurits should take over and protect the country. It was his right, and he had earned it. People applauded the Count's restraint for not having snatched power away from Oldenbarneveld thus far. The army had Maurits's back, just like he had had their backs during their most challenging battles, the largest of which, Newport, was still remembered as a betrayal at Oldenbarneveld's hands. The more Maurits undermined the arrogant, out-of-touch longskirts, the more beloved he became. And he knew it. Apparently, Oldenbarneveld misread the overwhelming support for the ancient systems of power and ignored the desires of foreign kings. These kings desperately wanted the Republic to become a kingdom, ruled by a god-appointed sovereign like Maurits, instead of a bunch of bakers and lawyers. Oldenbarneveld dismissed the wishes of foreign leaders as irrelevant. When he told people he suspected Maurits of Lestrana Concilia, Earl of Leicester-like behavior, the stadtholder was like, "He said, what now?" and marched straight into his States of Holland meeting and brought the Council of State with him. He warmly denied having any Leicesterian designs, but they should tell him if he had made mistakes. He should like to be allowed to improve in the future. Oldenbarneveld fumed, "You and the Council of State have no authority here. Go away!" "Well," Count Maurits explained, "I'm Holland's stadtholder. It's my job to keep the peace around these here parts. I just wanted to ask you to stop waging war against the people. So, ditch the fracking sharp resolution, stop forcing my men to take the new oath, and stop undermining my authority." The or else was implied. Rombout Hogebeets, Grand Pensionary of Leiden, told Maurits he was no longer welcome to discuss matters of state, his sovereign. The stadtholder responded, "I too recognize Holland is sovereign, but we might at least listen to each other once in a while." Maurits then walked right out, leaving Hogebeets looking like an idiot. Spain was running out of popcorn. Spain got excited about the Republic's apparent meltdown. Praise be the Lord! If anyone needed any more proof, the heretics in that stupid republic couldn't govern themselves. King Felipe didn't care who was in charge of the religion thing, the States General or the individual states. None of them were. Treaty Schmiedi, the King of Spain was still their lord, their legal sovereign, the decider of all. It was clear the people longed for the calm and peaceful ancient faith, and the King of Spain was ready to swoop in to the rescue and save them all from doom. Just come to Papa, kids. You know you want to. Spain developed a few plans to expedite the Republic's voluntary return to the realm. For instance, they should send in more Jesuits to help the Dutch convert. But Archduke Albrecht was like, "Don't even. Roman Catholics were tolerated for the moment. Let sleeping dogs lie." Several undercover Roman Catholics in the Council of State planned to unite all states and hand them over to the son of King Felipe, the Infante Felipe. Since everyone longed for a prince to rule them, Felipe Jr. was the best option, as long as he reigned independently of Spain. But the plan never got off the ground. Another plan to dig a canal in Flanders to the sea to undermine Holland's trade and tank the Republic's economy also failed. Okay, we'll workshop some more ideas. On November 11, 1617, the States General voted in favor of a national synod. It would be held in November the following year. The measure was carried by strict party lines, 5 against 2. The States of Holland immediately protested. This legislative assembly shouldn't cram a religious creed down the throats of half the population. That was their job. Reverend Johannes Uitenboogaard urged Oldenbarneveld to accept the vote. As a statesman, he could influence the outcome of the synod. But Oldenbarneveld refused to surrender state rights and swore to bring that ungrateful Nassau brat down a peg or two. In Holland, the Arminian faction got discouraged. Oldenbarnevelt and his trusty sidekick Hugo de Groot, Grand Pensionary of Rotterdam, desperately tried to keep everyone on board. English ambassador Dudley Carleton reported in April, Monsieur Barneveld presented to the towns of Holland a treatise written by Hugo de Groot to cheer their spirits by telling them that the old Batavians were hostis imperii Romani, and more such pedantic tales, concluding that, given that Holland is older, bigger, and richer than the rest of the United States, there should therefore be no national synod. De Groot had introduced the mythical Batavian origin story of the Dutch people in his Antiquitate Republicae Batavicae back in 1610. He said that the Dutch Batavi, a super badass tribe from the land of Maas and Waal with no kings, revolted against the invading Romans and defended their freedom. This Batavian origin story was quickly popularized in art and literature. So come on, everybody, we're the descendants of the Batavians, unafraid of he who shall not be named. Maurits. In November, the stadtholder took his bodyguards on tour, visiting various cities in southern Holland to push the crumbling Armenian bloc off the proverbial cliff. During his rallies, the Count gave inspired speeches telling everyone to approve the National Synod or the Republic was doomed. He then headed east. And this time, he also brought troops. Early in 1618, Count Maurits entered the city hall in Nijmegen. Nijmegen, ruled by Barneveldians, was the most Arminian city in the country. The stadtholder summoned all the magistrates to come before him and fired everyone, disbanding them as a company of mutinous soldiers, and appointed a new city council. This was his right according to the terms of the town surrender in 1591. Naturally, the newly installed council voted in favor of the National Synod and dismissed 3 Arminian pastors in April. Once more, the Count sat back and patiently waited to see if there was any fallout from this move. There wasn't. And then, something happened. Something Oldenbarneveld couldn't have seen coming, something he had feared, and something that wasn't gonna help him at all. On February 18, 1618, Prince Philips Willem of Orange, Count Maurits' eldest half-brother, enjoyed a nice dinner at Marquis Ambrogio Spinola's home in Brussels. But the next day, the prince woke up not feeling well. He was given an enema, but the chamberlain didn't use the syringe properly and damaged the intestinal wall. Philips Willem was bleeding out, and he deteriorated so fast that no clergy could be called to his bed. The prince died on February 20th, 1618. He was 63 years old. Some say this happened a day later, but his gravestone in the St. Sulpicius church in Diest marks his death on the 20th. Evil tongues immediately started wagging that Maurits was somehow involved in his brother's death, because, as per the 1609 agreement between the Nassau brothers, everything Philips Willem was, every title he held, and every piece of property he owned transferred to Count Maurits and a little bit to Frederik Hendrik. Philips Willem had no children, and his wife Eleonore de Bourbon-Condé got nothing. Philips Willem's younger sister, the Countess Maria of Nassau, had died in 1616 at 60. Now, the highest-ranking person in the Republic, Count Maurits, rose even higher in rank and became the Prince of Orange. One thing changed immediately. Instead of 4 horses before his carriage, he had 6 to indicate he was royalty. Maurits sent Frederik Hendrik to Orange to get him the crown. It is unclear why he didn't go himself. Maybe he didn't want to leave the country at this time. Maybe he wanted his brother as far away from Oldenbarneveld as possible. But most likely, because a journey to Orange included a mandatory visit with the King of France. Mooi Heintje was an excellent proxy. He had spent many years at royal courts, and unlike Maurits, Pretty Henry knew how to behave. Count Maurits was officially the Prince of Orange, a god-appointed sovereign, and all the foreign leaders praised the Lord. Oldenbarneveld was like, uh-oh. The civil unrest in Armenian towns became uncontrollable now that the garrisons at Den Briel, Heusden, Oudewater and other cities refused to obey orders of the city councils. Hugo de Groot was sent to Heusden during the city government elections to ensure that the Armenian government stayed Armenian, because the population was Gomarian. It did. But the moment de Groot left, a Gomarian mob stormed the town hall, removed the Armenian councillors and replaced them with their own. The will of the people prevailed. Democracy, after all. In March 1618, Prince Maurits, on his Take Over the Country tour, went to Arnhem, where the States of Gelderland was in session. "Hey, how's everybody doing?" In a short but sweet speech, he told them to stop listening to Holland and start acting in their own best interests. Gelderland caved, and Maurits laid low. On April 24th, 1618, Oldenbarneveld, at wit's end to see his pupil go rogue like that, wrote Maurits a long letter explaining everything. The letter started off by saying, "I noticed, to my greatest sorrow, a complete estrangement from your excellency." He told him that he tried to quit to please him, to stop listening to François van Aarsen's lies, explaining that Spain wasn't bribing him, apologizing for any offense, and concluding that he considered himself a lifelong servant of the prince. But his tone was condescending, and he boasted about his own achievements, failing to acknowledge any of Maurits's accomplishments. Oldenbarneveld's son-in-law, Cornelis van der Meylen, delivered the letter to Maurits's court, but the stadtholder never officially replied. However, when Maurits saw van der Meylen from his window, he opened it. The prince shouted at him that the letter was full of lies from a delusional old man. "I will grind the advocate and all his party into fine meal," the prince growled later, saying the quiet part out loud. In May 1618, Maurits showed up in Deventer at the meeting of the States of Overijssel. "Hey, how's everybody doing?" Overijssel caved, except for the unyielding Arminian city government of Kampen. Kampen thought that a synod would not solve anything, but would only bring more mischief and injustice among the provinces. So Maurits sent some diplomatic heavy hitters over to lean on that city's government, and Kampen caved. Again, Maurits laid low, keeping his eye out for trouble. There was none. When pressed to explain his reasoning, Maurits said that the sovereignty in the Republic was shared between the states and the States General, as it had been for the past 30 years, cleverly using the decades of Oldenbarneveld's complete control over the States General against him. The Arminians panicked and released a steady stream of pamphlets accusing Maurits of pursuing personal political ambitions. No one was impressed. This was not an insult. A prince was supposed to be ambitious. It comes with the job. The Gomarians countered that the stadtholder simply exercised his rights and that the States of Holland, as Carleton put it, had been undermining his authority for a long time and in fact left him nothing but the title of governor of the country. Team Maurits accused the baboons of mutiny against the stadtholder and the States General. Team Oldenbarneveld accused the mudbeggars of mutiny against the lawful sovereignty of each state. It was rebellion against rebellion, and day by day, a record number of pamphlets were spread spouting poisonous lies about both parties. Oldenbarneveld was a traitor, and Maurits was a lawless villain. Neither was true, but both men were very stubborn bastards. Speaking of bastards, Maurits's cousin, Willem Lodewijk's younger brother, Count Johan de Middel von Nassau, started dropping not-so-subtle hints that since the stadtholder's mother, Anna of Saxony, had given birth to a bastard child, Maurits probably wasn't even the natural son of Willem of Orange. The stadtholder flew into a rage when he heard this and cut Johan and his offspring from his will. Meanwhile, in the Habsburg Empire, Holy Roman Emperor Matthias's health was failing. The 54-year-old withdrew from public affairs to recuperate and spend time with his new young wife, Archduchess Anna of Tyrol. With King Felipe of Spain's full support, Matthias officially appointed his cousin and adopted son, the staunch Roman Catholic Ferdinand of Styria, as his heir. He also had him elected King of Hungary and the very Protestant Bohemia. The Bohemian nobles and the Protestants started losing sleep over this. The nobility feared losing their rights. The Protestants feared cuius regio eius religio. Ferdinand had often proclaimed that wicked Protestantism should be stamped out, and that he would restore the Roman Catholic Church, just as he had done in the Reformation stronghold of the Duchy of Styria back in 1595. The Protestants were on the verge of declaring war, but Ferdinand couldn't do much. The Spanish backed him, but he had to become Holy Roman Emperor first. Currently, there were 4 Roman Catholic electors and 3 Protestants. If that changed, there could be a Protestant emperor. Perhaps even the Calvinist Friedrich V, Prince-Elector of Pfalz, Prince Maurits' nephew. Friedrich saw himself as the leader of the Protestant electors and the defender of the liberty of the German nobles against the Roman Catholic Matthias. In 1618, the Protestants' nightmare became real when Ferdinand forbade the construction of Protestant churches on the king's land in Bohemia. The Protestants believed the lands were royal land and therefore part of the Letter of Majesty Agreement, the late Emperor Rudolf II's concession made with the Bohemian Protestants. But the Habsburg government disagreed, and Ferdinand promptly dissolved the Bohemian Assembly. On May 23, 1618, the Protestant members of the dissolved assembly, led by a disgruntled Count Jindřich Matthias of Thun-Valsacina, headed for the Chancellery in Prague. They told 4 of Ferdinand's Roman Catholic advisors, who had also just arrived, to explain the anti-Protestant measures. When they didn't answer fast enough, 2 Catholic hardliners, Count Jaroslav Božita of Martinice and Count Willem Slavata of Chlum, were hurled out of the council chamber window of the Racini castle, along with their secretary Philip Fabricius. All 3 survived the 70-foot drop from the 3rd floor. According to the Roman Catholics, because the angels had saved them, but the Protestants said they must have fallen on a dung heap. After this defenestration of Prague, Thurn established a Protestant government in Bohemia and called in the help of some powerful friends. And the Roman Catholic Habsburgers called in their friends. This will not end well. Utrecht, worried they were next on Prince Maurits's purge list, sent 8 deputies to The Hague to talk to their stadtholder and suggest some kind of compromise. But Team Oldenbarneveld intercepted them, and Holland deputies, including de Groot and Hogerbeets, met with them instead, in secret. Grotius insisted that they needed Waardgelders because Maurits had violated the sovereignty of the states and undermined their privileges and laws. They had successfully stopped the rebellion, and anyone who wanted to remove them was evil. But the states of Utrecht couldn't afford them. Plus, they didn't want to anger the prince. Grotius told them to go home. Holland would pay for their Waardgelders instead. They'd add another 400, just to be safe. The Utrecht group left, and the stadtholder never even knew they'd been in The Hague. On July 9, 1618, the States General debated the Waardgelder situation in Holland and Utrecht. The 2 states insisted they had the right to recruit and maintain troops for their internal affairs. But the other states felt that, under the terms of the Union, all defense matters, all armed forces, and the entire military command structure belonged to the federal government and the stadtholders. Ultimately, the States General voted 5 against 2 in favor of dismissing the Waardgelders. The States General told Stadtholder Maurits to take care of it. The state of Holland protested, but was ignored. Oldenbarneveld quickly put de Groot and Hogerbeets at the head of a Holland delegation and told them to get to Utrecht before the prince and his posse. They did on July 25, 1618. But this was a bad move. Holland government officials interfering in internal Utrecht state matters was, according to the Union of Utrecht, treason. But Oldenbarneveld, de Groot and their supporters didn't care about their hypocrisy. They were that desperate to stop Prince Maurits. Utrecht's Secretary of State, Gilles van Ledenberg, started moving between the Holland and Utrecht assemblies. And that's treason. Around noon, de Groot delivered Oldenbarneveld's instructions to all Utrecht Army unit officers that they owed allegiance first and foremost to the state who paid them, Holland. They should ignore any and all orders of the States General and Utrecht Stadtholder, or they'd get nothing. And that's treason. It didn't do much, because Prince Maurits and his cousin Count Ernst Casimir of Nassau-Dietz had already promised the men that Amsterdam would pay them as long as they obeyed the Stadtholder. When they heard Maurits was close with his army, de Groot freaked out. Close the gates, or everyone will die!" But the captains were like, "You think any of us can stop him? And you want to make him really mad?" Captain Harteveld told de Groot he would never raise a sword against Prince Maurits. De Groot ordered Sir John Ogle, commander of the forces paid for by Holland, to double the guard at the Weerdgate and set a watch outside the city to prevent Maurits' troops from taking the city by surprise. Ogle was like, "Are you nuts? I obey the Stadtholder of Utrecht and the States General only. Certainly not some pencil pushers from Holland." Ogle stalked out of the room and warned them, "You better start packing your bags, because when when the prince gets here, you're all in big trouble." The Stadtholder arrived that evening and walked through the wide open gates. A group of nervous magistrates welcomed him. The town's annual fair was in full swing, and Prince Maurits said with a grim smile, "You hardly expected such a guest at your fair. And what do you think of me? Now I have come." The following day, Prince Maurits joined the meeting of the Utrecht deputies. Hey, how's everybody? Well, I'll be darned. Fancy seeing Holland peeps in Utrecht. Are you guys lost? Sucks when that happens, am I right? There was this time I went to Newport. I mean, it was a mess, let me tell you. Okay, he was not that cheerful. The grim prince told Utrecht to disband the mercenaries and call for a synod. Never will I allow that a citizen is oppressed because of religion. I wish to be the father and protector of both parties. The Hollanders said that the rights of the states and the magistrates had to be secured first. Maurits said, the magistrates are to be protected, but we must first know how they're gonna govern. People have tried to introduce 5 false points into the divine worship. People have tried to turn me out of the stadtholdership and to drive me from the country. But I've taken my measures. I've got 5 states on my side, and 6 cities of Holland will send deputies to Utrecht to sustain me here. The Hollanders were like, wow, that escalated quickly. As for the Waardgelders, they are worse than Spanish fortresses, they must away. A little later in the conversation, the prince shouted, everything is the fault of Oldenbarneveld. De Groot said, if Oldenbarneveld were dead, all the rest of us would still deem ourselves bound to maintain the laws. People seem to despise Holland and wish to subject it to the other states. The stadtholder responded, on the contrary, it is Oldenbarneveld who wishes to make Holland the States General. Maurits was tired of arguing. There had been talk, drunken talk, but still talk about the necessity of keeping the stadtholder in check. Esquire van Oostrum had said, if the prince should undertake to attack any of the cities of Utrecht or Holland with a hard hand, it is settled to station 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers in convenient places. Then we shall say to the prince, if you don't leave us alone, we shall make an arrangement with the Archduke of Austria and resume obedience to him. We can make such a treaty with him, as he will give us religious freedom and save us from tyranny of any kind. I don't say this for myself, but I have heard it on good authority from very eminent persons. Maurits considered one of the eminent persons to be Oldenbarneveld, who plotted to drive him into exile and sell the country to the archdukes. The Hollanders protested that there was no design whatever against his princely dignity or person. The prince said not another word, and the people were like, aw man, there's gonna be a bloodbath with fighting in the streets, rioting, plundering, outraging. Great, just great. Three days later, on July 30th, 1618, Prince Maurits quietly ordered that 1,000 infantry assemble in absolute silence on Utrecht Market Square at 2:30 the following morning. And so it was done. The men blocked off all the entrances to the square and placed cannons to cover every street. At daybreak on Tuesday, July 31st, 1618, the prince and his staff appeared on the square. Most citizens were still asleep. Hey, how's everybody doing? Maurits calmly rode up to the single Waardgelder company stationed there and ordered them to lay down their arms. They obeyed without saying a word. The prince then summoned all other Waardgelder companies to the square one by one. They promptly obeyed, and in no time all 1,000 mercenaries laid down their arms at the feet of the prince. Once all weapons were neatly stacked in the square, the stadtholder calmly rode home to have some breakfast. There was no bloodbath, no rioting, no plundering, no outraging. Prince Maurits had disbanded all the Waardgelders without firing a single shot or waking anyone up. Ledenberg and several prominent council members fled the city in terror. De Groot and his posse also hightailed it out of there. Had they stayed, they would have been arrested. On August 4th, Maurits, at the head of his bodyguard, tramped up the stairs of Utrecht City Hall to address the magistrates gathered in assembly. He swapped out the council and replaced Ledenberg with his enemy, Nicolaas van Berk. Only a few of the original city council members remained. The new council quickly agreed to a synod and swore loyalty to the States General and the stadtholder. The prince then cleared out a church or two for contra-remonstrant services. With nearly the entire country in Maurits's corner, hey, how's Holland doing? Johan van Oldenbarneveld realized the jig was up. On August 14th, desperate to preserve the town's and the state's sovereignty, he told the Holland cities to fire the mercenaries and make it look voluntary. He crossed his fingers, hoping this would please Prince Maurits and he'd leave them alone. Count Willem Lodewijk warned Oldenbarneveld that he should accept a national synod immediately. The prince was spitting mad about Utrecht, which he considered a conspiracy against him and the state's constitution. The stadholder of Friesland, Groningen and Drenthe then arranged a meeting with Maurits and Oldenbarneveld. Willem Lodewijk was pro-Synod and anti-mercenaries, but Oldenbarneveld had always respected him and accepted the invitation. Maurits couldn't decline a meeting with the man he once called not a friend to the House of Nassau, but a father. At the stadholder's apartments, Oldenbarneveld, accompanied by a large delegation, told the prince that what had happened in Utrecht was never meant to disrespect him. They'd simply follow the law. He was devoted to the House of Nassau, but didn't want an illegal synod. Oldenbarneveld talked and talked, but Maurits said not a word. He wasn't angry, not friendly, just silent. Leiden and Rotterdam quietly discarded their waardgelders. Other cities soon followed. Still, Oldenbarneveld and de Groot hoped to avoid a complete capitulation. Fine. If there is to be a synod, they do everything to influence it. Holland rules. On August 28, 1618, the States General met, but they had not invited the States of Holland reps. Quite illegal, but secrecy was essential. They believed sovereignty was shared between the states and the States General and adopted a secret resolution. Holland and Utrecht had violated the Union of Utrecht, and Holland's odd resolution had undermined the country and the Union. They appointed Prince Maurits and a commission of the Generality to safeguard the common interest. The stadholder had orders to investigate recent subversive action by Holland and Utrecht against the Union and do whatever he felt was necessary for the country's prosperity, peace and safety. That evening, Councillor Adriaan Teding van Berkhout and a friend visited Oldenbarneveld sitting in his garden just chillin' and warned him of impending danger. Oldenbarneveld said gravely, "Yes, there are wicked men about." He lifted his hat courteously and said, "I thank you, gentlemen, for the warning." On the morning of August 29, 1618, Johan of Oldenbarneveld arrived in his carriage at the Binnenhof for his regular meetings. He had prepared a lengthy speech concerning the National Synod. Prince Maurits' Camerlengo asked the Attorney General to go to the stadholder's quarters at once. After Oldenbarneveld dropped off his papers, the 71-year-old climbed the stairs to Maurits' apartment with great difficulty. At the top of the stairs stood the captain of Maurits' guards, Pieter van der Meulen. He told Oldenbarneveld he was under arrest and took him to a room in the stadholder's quarters. The Attorney General was suspected of high treason because he'd planned to unleash a civil war, but he was also suspected of the much more severe offense of land treason, because he had planned to betray the country to the Spanish. The stunned Oldenbarneveld demanded to see the prince, but his request was denied. People were concerned for the elderly man's health, so they allowed Oldenbarneveld's servant, Jan Franken, to stay with him. This young man wrote a day-to-day account of what he saw happen next. A little later, Hugo de Groot and Rombout Hogerbeets arrived at the Binnenhof. They were also told to go see the prince, who was in a meeting with Oldenbarneveld. They were also arrested and locked up at the stadholder's court. That same day, Gilles van Ledenberg, former Secretary of State of Utrecht, was arrested in Utrecht and brought to The Hague soon after. Reverend Johannes Uyttenbogaert quickly fled the country with several other people whose names were not on the arrest order. The States of Holland wondered why Oldenbarneveld was late for their meeting. No one had told them of the pending arrests, and when they heard about it, they were stunned. Adriaan, Lord of Mathenesse, said, "You have taken from us our head, our tongue, and our hand. Henceforth, we can only sit in silence." They proclaimed that the arrest was illegal because it had been made on sovereign land, the State of Holland. The States General had no authority here. They didn't even have a prison. The States General explained that they had arrested 4 people for the security of the land and to return unity and friendship among its citizens. Oldenbarneveld had messed with Utrecht's internal affairs, and they, as the federal government, had every right to arrest him and his cronies to prevent a bloodbath. Holland sent a delegation to tell Prince Maurits off, but 6 cities, Dordrecht, Amsterdam, Schiedam, Enkhuizen, Edam and Purmerend, sided with Maurits and the government and sent their own delegation to the stadholder. One group told Maurits off, while the other group congratulated him for his actions, even though they feared the arrest had undermined the sovereignty of Holland. Maurits said he didn't dispute the laws and jurisdiction of Holland, but if they had a problem, they should take it up with the management, the States General. It was their order, not his. When one representative demanded that Oldenbarneveld be freed immediately, Maurits told him to shut his trap, or else he could join them. Oldenbarneveld's family found out about the arrest later that day. The Attorney General's younger son, Willem van Stoutenburg, and his brothers-in-law, Reinoud van Brederode, Lord of Veenhuizen, and Cornelis van der Meylen, went to Maurits to ask him to bail the man out. The prince told them, "It's the work of the States General. No harm shall come to your father any more than to myself." When Veenhuizen tried to excuse Oldenbarneveld's behavior concerning the cloister church situation, Maurits shouted, "Any man who says a word against the cloister church, his feet shall not carry him from this place." Van der Meylen fled to Paris to try to convince the French government to intervene. 3 days after his arrest, Oldenbarneveld was allowed to write letters. He wrote 3, one to the States of Holland, which was never delivered, one to Prince Maurits, the fate of which is unknown, and one to his wife and children, which they received. In it, Oldenbarneveld expressed his surprise at his arrest. However, he was sure it was all one big misunderstanding, and that with God's grace, the mistake would be rectified quickly. He was convinced that the States of Holland were so powerful that they would gather in assembly, overthrow the arrest order, and force Maurits to release him. They didn't. It soon rained pamphlets again for and against the Attorney General's arrest. The enemies of Oldenbarneveld convinced many that the Spaniards had paid the man a ton of gold to execute their plan. Step 1, weaken the church. Step 2, weaken resistance to peace. Step 3, regain Roman Catholic power. And, hey presto, everything was back in Spanish hands. But, praise the Lord, everything had been discovered in time, and the prince had saved them all. It seemed everyone hated the man, and anyone who didn't stayed silent, afraid to be arrested next. A contemporary said, "Many who had been promoted by him to high places and were wont to worship him as a god in hope that he would lift them up still higher now deserted him and ridiculed him and joined the rest of the world in heaping dirt upon him." The French had always loved and respected Oldenbarneveld. France's ambassadors Benjamin Aubry de Mourier and Jean de Thumery, Seigneur de Boissis, raged at the States General to release the man at once. They got nowhere. They pleaded with Prince Maurits for the prisoner, but he told them, "Oldenbarneveld has insulted me personally and boasted that he would drive me out of the country like the Earl of Leicester. The king will forgive me that I don't interfere. He is accused of wanting to create confusion in the country and return it under the Spanish yoke. Justice will rule. The states only are sovereign to judge this question. You must address yourself to them." The French intervention attempts weren't helping Oldenbarneveld. On the contrary, they made it worse. The Republic's former ambassador for France, François van Aarsens, accused the French of foul play. This, in turn, made King Louis XIII so mad that he suspended all diplomatic relations with the Republic. And French theologians weren't allowed to attend the planned synod anymore either. The Contra-Remonstrants didn't care that the king married to a Spanish chick was angry. Of course he was mad. The plan of his Spanish masters had been foiled by the ever-vigilant Prince of Orange. But the French only wanted to help the country deal with their religious troubles, and they did so in defiance of Spain and the Pope, who were more than happy to see the heretics destroy each other. With Concino Concini's influence gone, the King of France was eager to drop Spain. He had sent all his Spanish courtiers packing, including those of his wife Queen Anna, except her confessor, physician, apothecary, and cook. Since she only spoke Spanish, she became isolated and sad. But yay, the king promised that from now on he would share her bed. Apparently, it only now dawned on him that he was married to her. Meanwhile, King Felipe III's valido, or first minister, Francisco Gómez de Sandoval y Rojas, Duke of Lerma, had managed to piss off just about everyone with his government style. Queen Margareta and the Circle of Ladies had exposed Lerma's corruption a few years earlier, but she had died in childbirth in 1611. But now, the ambitious Gaspar de Guzmán y Pimentel Ribera y Velasco de Toba, El Conde de Olivares, a courtier of King Felipe's son, made his move. He manipulated Lerma's son, Cristóbal Gómez de Sandoval, Duque de Utrera, to conspire against his father. Lerma saw his days as a valido were numbered, and quickly got Pope Paul V to make him a cardinal, so he'd be protected when it all came crashing down. On October 4th, King Felipe reluctantly signed a decree renouncing the powers of his valido. The Cardinal Duke was very sad to leave, but retired. Utrera replaced his father at court as valido and had constant access to the king, but Felipe drastically limited his powers. For 2 months, Prince Maurits traveled from city to city in Holland and replaced all those sympathetic to Oldenbarneveld with his own supporters. Everywhere the routine was executed like the well-oiled machine that characterized his military campaigns. The prince and his 300 guards entered the city gates, followed by 2 regiments and a train of 100 wagons. His halbertmen tramped up the grand staircases of the city halls and summoned the boards of magistrates to come before the prince. He thanked them for their service, telling them it was nothing personal, and announced the new magistrates from a list he had prepared earlier using the suggestions of trusted allies. Some city councils mumbled protests, but no one gave the prince any real trouble. Only in Hoorn, where the citizens protested loudly, did its mayor request the prince to not change the magistracy. But on November 16, 1618, Prince Maurits placed a regiment in a half-moon formation on the square beneath the windows of City Hall to keep the rabble away, summoned all the magistrates before him, and dismissed them all. When they asked why, Maurits' reply was short and sweet. The quiet of the land requires it. It is necessary to have unanimous resolutions in the States General at The Hague. This cannot be accomplished without these preliminary changes. I believe that you had good intentions and have been faithful servants of the fatherland, but this time it must be so. Did the stadtholder have the power to do this? The jury's still out on that one. 400 years later. Both Maurits and Oldenbarneveld had taken what we today would consider extra-legal measures. Oldenbarneveld's actions risked blowing up the Republic, whereas Maurits' actions were meant to preserve the Republic. So, yeah. Either way, the revolution was bloodless. The speed with which magistrates were replaced sometimes led to errors. Some people on the list weren't even qualified because they weren't citizens yet of the place they were supposed to govern. When someone asked the stadtholder who a new magistrate on the list was, the prince replied with a cheerful laugh. Heck if I know. The prince showed up with much pomp and ceremony in Amsterdam and received a hero's welcome. Most on the Amsterdam City Council were Gomarians, but there were still a few Arminians lurking around. The stadtholder summoned the board before him and dismissed them all. They all complied without protest. This baffled the 72-year-old former mayor Cornelis Pieterszoon Hooft, father of famous historian and author Pieter Corneliszoon Hooft. He turned to his silent colleagues and asked whether anyone had something to say in defense of their laws and privileges. Nah, we're good. The old man, a personal friend of Oldenbarneveld, rose to address the stadtholder. He had been a government member for 36 years and had always been a friend of the House of Nassau. The summary deposition of the magistracy was illegal and unnecessary. Maurits' reply was terse. Grandpapa, it must be so this time. Necessity and the service of the country require it. With that, the prince dismissed the 36 magistrates. He appointed a new board the next day who were duly sworn to fidelity to the States General. Most could stay, naturally. Hooft remained on as well. When Maurits was finally done, the 7 states, States General and the States Provincial were as one. The states of Holland formally thanked the prince for all that he had done and instated a special court to put Oldenbarneveld and his men on trial. In November 1618, a bright comet appeared in the night sky. At this time, comets were considered to bring a message to mankind. Prince Maurits saw it as a justification for his action. Maurits' power in Holland was now greater than Oldenbarneveld's ever was, but he knew this would not end well. Not for Oldenbarneveld and not for him. A few weeks before the arrest, he had told Venetian Cristoforo Soriano, "It's going to take a lot of effort to debunk the suspicion that I want to control the country. I have now, without much effort, as much power as I want. I have standing and popularity. But if I had to rule a people that is used to freedom while weighed down by taxes, I would become a slave to the country. Loved by no one and envied by many. Never in the world did I ever think about that." Well, Oldenbarneveld had managed to do all that just fine. On September 7, 1618, the States General ordered that Johan of Oldenbarneveld be relocated to another building. The Attorney General protested that the States General had no jurisdiction over him. The States General told him to shut up and move. His new prison was in a building behind the Ridderzaal. On the first floor was a large courtroom, today called the Rolzaal, the trial's location. On the second floor were 3 chambers. The first one was reserved for the judges, the second was Hugo de Groot's prison, the third Oldenbarneveld's. Hogebeets and Ledenberg were confined in another building. Oldenbarneveld climbed the tower's winding narrow stairs with incredible difficulty. When he entered the room, he realized this is the Admiral of Aragon's apartment. It was not a dungeon nor a jail. It was a 25-square-foot room with a high-vaulted ceiling and some decent furniture. But the windows were barred, and a guard was always at the door. His servant Franken stayed with him, but Oldenbarneveld was never allowed visitors, never met the other prisoners, and never saw anyone but the guards. His papers were taken away, and he was initially given no writing materials, and he had no idea what was happening on the outside. One day, a basket of fine pears was brought to him from his own garden. When Franken sliced one open with a knife, he found a part of a quill with a very thin piece of paper rolled up inside with tiny Latin writing. Don't rely upon the States of Holland, for the Prince of Orange has changed the magistracies in many cities. Dudley Carleton is not your friend. More messages were found rolled up in pears and bundles of cinders. However, at some point, the guards thought that the pears were too nice a treat for Oldenbarneveld, and one of them took one home like a trophy. The pear was served for dessert at the dinner table. The fruit was cut into pieces, revealing the little note inside. So, no more apples or pears for the prisoner. The States General couldn't start the trial for the Hollanders until Prince Maurits had overturned all of Holland's governments. However, the Utrechters' trial started in September. Gilles van Ledenbergh was very depressed and wailed, "Oh, Oldenbarneveld, what have you brought us to?" They threatened him with torture, and some say they even had the executioner come in to push him around a little. Ledenbergh confessed, among other things, that Holland had interfered in Utrecht state business by sending deputies to the state without being invited, and that Holland had paid for a garrison in Utrecht. Ledenbergh prayed long and hard when he returned to his prison. He then gave his 18-year-old son Joost, who slept in the room, a letter written in French, a language the young man couldn't read. That night, on September 28, 1618, at 2 o'clock in the morning, Joost heard his father groan. When he reached for him in the dark, his arm was stone cold. Ledenbergh was dead. He was 68. He had killed himself with knives he had kept hidden among some papers. He hoped his death would prevent his property from being seized, so his family would be looked after. The States General was bummed that the trial fizzled out like that. The family begged for Ledenbergh's body for a decent burial, but it was refused. The body would be kept above ground until his sentencing. Hugo de Groot buckled under increasing pressure. Immediately after his arrests, rumors flew that he was ready to share important information in exchange for Prince Maurits's protection. De Groot became terrified and begged to talk to Maurits about this. The prince refused. He didn't want to get involved. De Groot then distanced himself from Oldenbarneveld. He apologized for his youth and inexperience and claimed that he had been led astray by older and wiser men. Though De Groot was also threatened with torture, the examiners mainly appealed to his sense of justice and his desire to help the country. He told them Oldenbarneveld had so fiercely protected Holland's rights not only from a sense of justice, but also because he had an insatiable hunger for power. A national synod was convened in Dordrecht to settle the religious matters once and for all and to properly establish church doctrine. The national synod was actually international, with 26 people from 8 different countries attending. Prince Maurits had wanted it in The Hague, but Dordrecht had been eventually selected. It was the first city of Holland, the place that had hosted the first free meeting of the States of Holland in 1572, where Prince Willem of Orange had taken his first Calvinist communion in 1573, and where they had held the first national synod with all 17 states in 1578. The more practical reason why Dordrecht was the best place to talk about church doctrine was that since there were no Arminian preachers in the city, the risk of riots was very low. The synod started on November 13, 1618. Quite modern for its age, there was a public gallery where anyone could watch the proceedings. This was a lot of fun, if you understood Latin. The synod's first decision was that, like the King James Bible a few years earlier, they would commission a proper Dutch translation of the Bible. They called it the Statenbijbel, and it was finished some 20 years later. The States Bible is still being used exclusively in the Reformed Church today. Oldenbarneveld had been incarcerated for months with no charges brought against him. This was a violation of the state laws, which stated that a prisoner should go free if an accusation wasn't made within 6 weeks of an arrest. It was moot for Oldenbarneveld anyway. The States General had absolutely no authority. He kept insisting only the States of Holland could judge him, though at this point, that wouldn't have helped him at all. On November 15, 1618, 2 days after the synod started, Oldenbarneveld's interrogations began at last. Initially, they had wanted to make him stand like a common criminal, but as the old man entered the room, leaning on his cane, they felt bad and allowed him to sit down. The seat had no armrest, though. There was no bill of indictment, no arraignment, no counsel. There were no witnesses and no arguments. Oldenbarneveld wasn't allowed to talk to a lawyer or even a friend. When Oldenbarneveld asked for a list of the allegations so he could think about it, he was denied. He demanded pen and paper, but he was denied. All he had was his memory, which worked just fine. And so, for 14 days, Oldenbarneveld sat, answering trick questions without a lawyer or documents to refresh his memory. The examination dug up a lot of dirt. He had played games, bribed people, been bribed, enriched himself considerably, had undertaken secret diplomacy, had used spies, and so on. He had committed lèse-majesty when he told King Henri IV of France that Count Maurits would become sovereign over his dead body. He had withheld King Henri's peace talks. He had withheld attempts by the late Prince Philips Willem of Orange to make peace. Oldenbarneveld never denied the allegations. Instead, he maintained that everything he had done was part of the job and for the good cause. His rebuttals were many pages long, painstakingly recounting, explaining, and justifying the reasons for every single thing he had done. At the synod, the Remonstrants had been invited to join in the discussions, but they were dramatically removed a month later after they had spent weeks just complaining about the schedule and nothing else. The chairman, Reverend Johannes Bogerman, had shouted, "Ite, ite, go, go." Meanwhile, Gomarians, emboldened by the synod, drove Arminians out of the churches. It gradually became impossible for these heretics to worship anywhere in Holland. On December 21st, 1618, Nicolaas van Berg of Utrecht gave a very damning testimony. He testified that Oldenbarneveld had once told him that the differences regarding the divine worship were not so significant. At the same time, he asked whether it would not be better that we should submit ourselves again to the King of Spain. Berg couldn't specify the day, month, or even year when Oldenbarneveld had said this, but it had to be before 1611. At the end of January 1619, de Groot was asked to write down all the things that he believed proved that Oldenbarneveld was out to destabilize the Republic. He had been presented with facts that Oldenbarneveld was in cahoots with the Spanish. These were lies, but de Groot didn't have the heart to tell the judges off. Oldenbarneveld's actual trial started in February 1619, but to call it a trial is a stretch. At least it wasn't something we would today recognize as a trial. A national court system didn't exist, the States General didn't have a tribunal, and they'd only tried sovereign states, never individuals. Plus, the Republic's law was in a funny place. The legal principles of Charles V and Philippe II were insufficient, and the old Roman laws weren't considered suitable for this kind of court case. The States General improvised and assembled a board of 24 commissioners to lead the process, 12 from Holland and 2 from each of the other 6 states. Some later claimed that these judges were all sworn enemies of Oldenbarneveld, but this wasn't true. Most appeared to be men of integrity and were quite unhappy to be assigned this duty. Of those not entirely sympathetic with Oldenbarneveld, only Reinier Pauw could be considered an enemy. The 3 prosecuting officers were Pieter van Leeuwen of Utrecht, Laurens Silla of Gelderland, and Antonis Duyck of Holland. Of these, Duyck despised Oldenbarneveld, and he was angling for his job. During the trial, the stadtholder remained in the background as much as possible. He met with no one and turned down Oldenbarneveld's multiple requests for a meeting. When family members came to him to ask if they could visit Oldenbarneveld, he told them that that was a matter of the States General. He had no say in it. When the judges were appointed, he wasn't asked anything and was kept out of the loop of the entire process. He made sure no one could accuse him of steering the courts in any direction. Though he couldn't stay entirely out of the loop, he knew too many people. On March 7, 1619, the Attorney General was called to the stand and was informed of the accusations. The list was a mile long, but here are some highlights. He had given Arminians free rein and influenced King James to back him up. He had opposed the National Synod and planned to break the Union over it so he wouldn't have to submit to the will of the other states. He had committed lèse-majesty by claiming Prince Maurits wanted to be the country's sovereign and making it seem he was conspiring against Holland. He wrote the Sharp Resolution and used it to undermine the stadtholder and the States General. He had closed the courts of justice. He had gotten involved in Utrecht's internal affairs by sending a Holland delegation and had warned mercenaries to oppose the prince. He had received gifts from foreigners. Long story short, he had conspired to turn the Republic into a bloodbath to hand over the country to Spain. But he didn't stand accused of accepting bribes from the enemy or other acts of high treason. Day after day, with frequent breaks, Oldenbarnevelt was led down the narrow stairs to the courtroom below his prison. He argued for 3 days about how his actions had been justified and that the prince, the people, nor the States General understood the Constitution like he did, which he had always applied truthfully and consistently. His arrogance may have been justified, but for someone trying to save his head, this wasn't helping him. He insisted that the States General had no authority to put him on trial. However, he was willing to answer all their questions honestly. The judges buried Oldenbarnevelt under a deluge of rambling, disconnected, irrelevant and tangled questions about what he had done for the last 40 years. They were meant to confuse the accused, throw him off balance, and lead him into self-contradiction so they could distill a confession from his answers. He often said he didn't remember, but this wasn't always credible. The government had one job: to get a conviction. If Oldenbarnevelt was declared innocent, it would severely undermine Prince Maurits's position. Oldenbarnevelt was dead tired after each day in court. He would lay on his bed speechless, but revived enough to go through the same ordeal the next day. Between March 7th and March 26th, Oldenbarnevelt was interrogated 26 times. His final court appearance was on April 14, 1619. On May 1st, the court concluded its session and reached a verdict. The proceedings had been kept secret from the public, so there were wild rumors about what was happening inside. Most believed the prisoners would be acquitted of the more severe charges, but that they would be stripped from all their offices. Oldenbarnevelt knew better. Jan Franken kept asking the guard how much longer they would remain imprisoned. The guard told him maybe 14 days, and then they'd be gone. Franken thought it meant that they would be free again. Oldenbarnevelt knew better. On May 11th, Oldenbarnevelt was told that he'd hear his verdict the following day. As he went to bed, he said, "It is a bitter folk. I have nothing good to expect of them." Oldenbarnevelt's verdict was odd, and that's an understatement. There were a lot of insinuations and implications, a little bit of declaration, and no evidence. They simply took the Attorney General's detailed answers and rebuttals and said it was his confession. They strongly suspected land treason, but they couldn't torture the old man to prove it. It would have killed him. The prisoner, Johan of Oldenbarnevelt, without being put to the torture and without fetters of iron, has confessed to having perturbed religion, greatly afflicted the Church of God, and carried into practice exorbitant and pernicious maxims of state. For this and other things, he had to be punished. Since some feared an imprisoned or banished Oldenbarnevelt could become the center of intrigue to get him back to power, the long, rambling preamble ended with these decisive words. Therefore, the judges, in the name of the Lord States General, condemn the prisoner to be taken to the Binnenhof, there to be executed with the sword that death may follow, and they declare all his property confiscated. Though the judges unanimously found Oldenbarnevelt guilty of high treason, 3 had wanted perpetual imprisonment instead of decapitation. However, when reports came in, conveniently on cue, of another plot to assassinate Prince Maurits, the men withdrew their opposition. At 5:30 p.m., Oldenbarnevelt was told he was summoned to appear before the judges the following day to hear his death sentence. He was stunned and shocked. The sentence of death? The sentence of death? The sentence of death? I never expected that. I thought they were gonna hear my defense again. I had intended to make some change in my previous statements, having set some things down when beside myself with choler. Oldenbarnevelt demanded pen, ink, and paper, that for the last time I may write farewell to my wife. Permission was granted, but Scylla warned him to be careful what he wrote. Oldenbarnevelt was like, what are they gonna do? Cut off my head twice? Reverend Antonius Valleus came in to comfort the prisoner in his final hours. However, Oldenbarnevelt begged him to do him a favor instead. Prince Maurits was not surprised to hear about the death sentence. According to Carleton, he considered it a political necessity. But even though the sentence may have been necessary, carrying it out was not. Just like a governor in the United States of America today can stay in execution, Stadtholder Maurits had the power to hold the execution of Oldenbarnevelt, or at least he could tell the States General and they would commute the sentence. But Maurits didn't want to pardon Oldenbarnevelt himself. He wanted a family member, a friend, or the accused to beg for it. Count Willem Lodewijk, though ultra-contra-remonstrant, had a soft spot for Oldenbarnevelt and wanted to save his life. He and Duyck held a 3-hour top-secret meeting in the prince's private cabinet. They decided Willem Lodewijk should convince Maurits' stepmother, Louise de Coligny, to urge Oldenbarnevelt's family to ask for a pardon. She was the only one of the Nassau clan that the Oldenbarnevelts might listen to. Louise talked to a spokesperson of the family, the wife of Oldenbarnevelt's eldest son, Anna Weitsen, Lady of Groeneveld. The family said no. They stood by the prisoner, maintaining his innocence. They knew he preferred death over a disgraced life by admitting guilt for something he did not do. Though the loss of Oldenbarnevelt's head was a victory for the enemy, the loss of his honor would be an even greater victory. Maurits was irritated that no one asked for a pardon. How could they be so sure of his innocence? He held out hope that Oldenbarnevelt, once face to face with the executioner, would cave at the very last second. Then, at 10 p.m., there was a knock on the door. Someone had a message from the dead man walking. The Reverend Valleus arrived in the stadtholder's apartment and gave him a message from Oldenbarnevelt. Tell His Excellency that I have always served him with upright affection so far as my office, duties, and principles permitted. If I, in the discharge of my oath and official functions, have ever done anything contrary to his views, I hope that he will forgive it, and that he will hold my children in his gracious favor. Maurits listened with tears in his eyes. He replied, "He has always been dear to me. I mourn his fate, and I've always urged that the issues could be resolved in moderation. However, it is also true that he had something against my person, what disappointed me. But his children I will, as long as they behave, keep in good favor." 2 things, however, had always made him angry. That Oldenbarnevelt had accused him of wanting the sovereignty, and the stunt he had pulled in Utrecht, which had put him and his men in danger. Yet, he forgave him for everything. As Valleus was about to leave the apartment, the prince called him back. Did he say anything of a pardon? The clergyman answered, "My lord, I cannot with truth say that I understood him to make any allusion to it." Maurits' message was conveyed to Oldenbarnevelt, who said, "His Excellency has been deceived in regard to the Utrecht business, especially as to one point, but it is true that I had fear and apprehension that he aspired to the sovereignty or to more authority in the country. Ever since the year 1600, I have felt this fear, and have tried that these apprehensions might be rightly understood." Several preachers now arrived in Oldenbarnevelt's prison to offer him consolation, but Oldenbarnevelt was calm, except for the anger that he felt for the utter stupidity of the proceedings. "I am ready enough to die, but I cannot comprehend why I am to die. I have done nothing except in obedience to the laws and privileges of the land, and according to my oath, honor, and conscience. I console myself in the Lord my God, who knows all hearts and shall judge all men. God is just." They asked him if there was anything he wanted to repent and ask God for mercy. "This I know well, that I have never willingly done wrong to any man." It was 11 o'clock. Oldenbarnevelt prayed with one of the reverends and then sent them away. He would try to get some sleep, but he couldn't. Around midnight, Oldenbarnevelt asked for his servant to read from a prayer book, but his guard called in a clergyman who read the consolations of the sick to him. Oldenbarnevelt wondered what the fate of de Groot and Hogebeets was, but the reverend didn't know. Once more he tried to sleep. He couldn't. After an hour, he called for his French psalm book and read for a while. Sometime after 2 o'clock, the clergyman came in again and asked once more if there was anything that troubled his conscience. "I have not slept, but am perfectly tranquil. I am ready to die, but cannot comprehend why I must die. I wish from my heart that through my death and my blood all disunion and discord in this land may cease." He remained quiet for a while, then ordered Franken to cut open the front of his shirt. When this was done, he said, "Jan, are you to stay by me to the last?" "Yes, if the judges permit it." When he told the servant he'd asked his family to look after him, a grateful Franken said, "As long as I live, I shall remember your lordship in my prayers." Oldenbarnevelt responded, "No, Jan, that's popish. When I'm dead, it's all over with prayers. Pray for me while I still live. Now is the time to pray. When one is dead, one should no longer be prayed for." At 4 a.m., Louise de Coligny knocked on Prince Maurits's door to plead on Oldenbarneveld's behalf. She hated what her stepson had done. This act put her son, Maurits's half-brother Count Frederik Hendrik, in a terrible position. However, the wily Count found a way to keep his mom and his brother happy. He never entirely supported nor opposed Maurits. This would become a familiar tactic later in life. The prince refused to see his stepmother, and they told her Maurits was asleep. At the same time, Oldenbarneveld's wife Maria and her children asked His Excellency and the judge commissioners to see Oldenbarneveld one last time. A little before 5 o'clock, Franken heard the bell ring in the judge's apartment. They were about to assemble. Oldenbarneveld said, "I may as well get up then. They mean to begin early, I suppose. Give me my doublet, but one pair of stockings." He usually wore 2 or 3 pairs at a time. As Franken handed him the combs and brushes, he said with a smile, "Jan, this is for the last time." He asked Franken to bring his nightcap as a blindfold. He then swallowed a half glass of wine with a strengthening cordial in it, as he always did. The French ambassador once more appealed to the States General to ask for clemency in the name of King Louis, but no one would listen. The clergyman returned at 6 a.m. and asked Oldenbarneveld if he'd slept at all. No. Valerius asked, "Has my lord any desire to speak with his wife or children or any of his friends?" No. The time is drawing near. It would excite a new emotion. Oldenbarneveld hadn't been told his family explicitly asked for it. It was 7 o'clock. He wrote his family another letter. "Very dear wife and children, it's going to an end with me. I am, through the grace of God, very tranquil. I hope that you are equally so, and that you may, by mutual love, union, and peace, help each other to overcome all things, which I pray to the Omnipotent as my last request. Jan Franken has served me faithfully for many years and throughout all these my afflictions, and is to remain with me to the end. He deserves to be recommended to you and be furthered to good employments with you or with others. I request you herewith to see to this. I have requested His Princely Excellency to hold my sons and children in his favor, to which he has answered that so long as you conduct yourselves well, this shall be the case. I recommend this to you in the best form and give you all into God's holy keeping. Kiss each other and all my grandchildren for the last time in my name, and fare you well. Out of the Chamber of Sorrow, May 13, 1619, your dear husband and father, Johan van Oldenbarneveld. P.S. You will make Jan Franken a present in memory of me." Oldenbarneveld could now hear the sound of the drums and the soldiers marching to the inner court. Valerius now came back with a message from the judges. "The High Commissioners think it's beginning. Will my lord please to prepare himself?" The prisoners said, very well, very well. Shall we go at once?" Valerius suggested a prayer first. When they finished, they went downstairs. When Oldenbarneveld arrived at the door, he was told there'd been a misunderstanding. Could he wait a little? So, back upstairs to his chamber, the old man went and sat to read in his French songbook. 30 minutes later, he was summoned again and was escorted to the basement of the great hall of the court. In the center of the vast hall stood a large table. Seated around it in their black caps and gowns were the 24 judges and the 3 prosecuting officers. The room was lined with soldiers and spectators who had been waiting there all night. The prisoner sat down on a chair, and Clerk Potts read the long sentence. During the reading, Oldenbarneveld wanted to interrupt the clerk at several preposterous passages. Still, he managed to keep his mouth shut. Then Oldenbarneveld was allowed to speak. He said, "The judges have put down many things which they have no right to draw from my confession. Let this protest be added. I thought too that my lords the States General would have had enough in my life and blood that my wife and children might keep what belongs to them. Is this my recompense for 43 years' service to these provinces?" The court president Nicolas de Vaux rose and pointed to the door. "Your sentence has been pronounced. Away, away." Without another word, the old man got up from his chair. Oldenbarneveld strode across the hall, leaning on his cane, accompanied by Franken, the provost, and soldiers. A little before 9 o'clock on May 13, 1619, Johan of Oldenbarneveld, leaning on his stokske, entered the Binnenhof. The place was filled with thousands of spectators. A stage had been hurriedly built against the front facade of the Ridderzaal. His executioner, the German Hans Pruim, stood there waiting. There was also a coffin. They had thought about a coffin that fit him too late, so they had taken one from storage intended for murderers. The old man said, "This is a nice compensation for my 40 years of loyal service. Oh God, what becomes of man?" Franken helped Oldenbarneveld onto the scaffold. "Isn't there even a chair or a pillow for me to kneel on?" Someone offered to get a chair, but he already knelt down on the rough planks and, after 15 minutes of prayers, took his garments off. He pointed at Pruim, who stood waiting with his long, double-edged sword. "Don't let him come near me yet." He then turned to the silent audience and said with a powerful voice, "Men, do not believe that I am a traitor to the country. I have ever acted uprightly and loyally as a good patriot, and as such I shall die." He stepped up to the heap of sand in the middle of the scaffold that was meant to catch his blood. He looked up and said, "Christ shall be my guide. O Lord, my heavenly Father, receive my spirit." He asked for his nightcap that he pulled over his eyes, and then, "Make it quick, make it quick." Not to the executioner, but to his servant Franken. He shouldn't take too long to say goodbye. A chopping block wasn't used in Holland, so Oldenbarneveld knelt up straight, with his hands held in prayer to his chest. The executioner said to Franken, "Get out of the way." A few seconds later, the blade came down. The blow took Oldenbarneveld's head and 2 of his fingers. The blood poured over the scaffold. The audience rushed to the stage to catch it with cloth, to sell it later. The dismembered body and head were put in the coffin, nailed loosely shut, and placed in the chapel. The family was then allowed to transfer the body to an oak coffin. No one knows where the coffin is now. Some believe it's still at the Binnenhof. Renovations are currently underway at the Binnenhof, and they will try to find it. Prince Maurits hadn't watched the execution. Captain François de l'Aubespine Marquis d'Hauterive declared that he was with the prince in his cabinet during the whole period of the execution. Maurits had ordered all the windows and shutters to be kept closed, and no one wearing his uniform was allowed to be outside. The prince anxiously received messages concerning the proceedings, perhaps still hoping for a request for a pardon. When he heard of the final catastrophe, he was devastated. He could have stopped it, and he hadn't. There was no coming back from this, and he knew it. Oldenbarneveld's trial had been deliberately held up to give the synod time to wrap up. This way, the man and the religion were condemned at the same time. On April 23, 1619, the canons were signed by all the members of the synod. It concluded on May 29th after 180 sessions. It was established that 2 forms of divine worship in one country were forbidden by God's word, and that thenceforth by Netherland law there could be but one religion, namely the Reformed or Calvinistic creed. Arminians were pronounced heretics, dividers, and teachers of false doctrines. They were no longer allowed to fill any clerical or academic posts. They put together a manuscript of faith, a catechism, and a summary of the doctrine of the Church called The Decision of the Synod of Dort on the 5 main points of the doctrine in dispute in the Netherlands. It is also known as the Canons of Dordrecht or the Dordtse leerregels. The 5 points were total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Tulip. The effect was immediate and brutal. Where initially Arminian preachers had been condoned, they now had to toe the line or leave the country. Both things happened. However, this was not over, and the state still kinda did what they wanted anyway. Secretary Gilles van Ledenberg was put on trial, convicted, sentenced, and executed next. Wait. Wasn't he already dead? Why, yes. Yes, he was. Still, Ledenberg was sentenced to be hanged, and his property was confiscated posthumously. His unburied mummified remains were thrown into a coffin and hung outside The Hague, next to the decaying bodies of Jean de Paris and Jean de la Vigne, and other criminals swinging in chains. So, taking his own life to help his family hadn't worked. De Groot had heard the reading of Oldenbarneveld and Ledenberg's sentences through the open window of his prison. He was worried because the stage in front of the Ridderzaal remained. When he was told the 3 executioners hadn't left town, De Groot and Hogerbeets were sure they were dead men. But their families couldn't be persuaded to plead for mercy for them either. De Groot's wife, Maria van Rijgersberg, said that if her husband had deserved it, they should cut off his head. Prince Maurits then told her that one of 2 roads must be taken, that of the law or that of pardon. Finally, on May 18, 1619, Hugo de Groot and Rombout Hogerbeets were convicted of high treason. However, the 2 men received commuted sentences, life imprisonment. In the middle of the night on June 5, 1619, the prisoners were taken to Loevestein Castle under heavy guard. They sat side by side in a prisoner's carriage with heavy chains on their hands and feet. During their journey, the people in the streets hurled insults at them, yelling at them that they were land traders and dirty Arminians. The duo arrived in Gorinchem, were put on a boat and taken across the Merwede to Loevestein Castle. They were led across the drawbridge through 13 doors, each secured by iron bolts and heavy locks, to their separate apartments where they would live with their families. Their warden was Jacob Pruning van Deventer, the son of one of the Earl of Leicester's men who Oldenbarneveld had unceremoniously removed from power. Naturally, the warden made the prisoners' lives unbearable. De Groot, however, was already plotting his escape. Oldenbarneveld's sons plotted to avenge their father's death, while the 12-year truce was about to expire.